So thank you for joining us for a session on research data management and the FAIR principles. So the session will be recorded. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat and I will try to look at them at the end of the session. If you don't want to be on the recording, like your voice or your name or anything like that. But feel free to use the chat. So I'm going to cover what is research data management, why should researchers care about research data management, and talk a little bit about the tri-agency's RDM policy. I'll cover some good RDM practices. So what are some best practices in terms of like doing specific RDM practices in your work. And I'll talk a little bit about making data fair. And I think we won't have time to talk about the Dataverse, but I will send some information with the slides in that case. So research data management in general, it's sort of related to all the activities involved with data for a research project. So that's, from the beginning of the project when you're creating or collecting data and planning for its use, when you're organizing the data, structuring the data, naming the files, all of those activities, all those very detail-oriented kind of activities where you decide to keep the data, if you have to make it secure. Who do you provide access to? How do you provide access? Where are you storing it? Where are you backing it up? How are you processing your data? What software are you using? And then, how you share the data more broadly at the end of your project, or whether you do or you don't share it, or how you can make it available for reuse or not. So some of these decisions, but it's not necessarily saying you have to do that, but more like thinking that through and having a plan for that as well. So why should we care about research data management? Well, it's useful. It's like project management. So if you're more organized and you have your information is structured and follows a schematic or a plan, it's easier for you to figure out, where to drop the project and pick it up, or to work with your data over time, or to collaborate with other people who also have to use the data in the research project as well. There's also some mandated aspects of this. So the tri-agencies have come out with like a harmonized RDM policy, meaning it's all three agencies that have one policy essentially. And the items of that policy that would be relevant for researchers or students or trainees would be the funding opportunities that are requiring data management plans. So if you're applying for new funding, a lot of the streams are now requiring data management plans. And that's like a 3 to 4 page sort of document, like detailing all of those aspects about how you're collecting the data, where you're storing it, how you're naming the data files, all that kind of stuff. And they will start to roll out a data deposit plan as well, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And then internationally, many funding agencies have required data management planning for some time. So Horizon Europe has required data management plans, or is now requiring pretty robust data management plans. The NSF, NIH had started requiring these as well. So essentially for DMPs, for some of the funding opportunities, they're going to ask for data management plans at the time of the application. So that's an extra amount of writing you would do when you're applying for the grant. The data deposit requirement, they've announced recently a couple months ago that they're expecting to roll this out in 2026 for new grants. So not for ones that are already funded, but for people applying to new grants, in 2026. Some of those opportunities will require that the researcher commits to depositing the data from the project in a digital repository. So that includes all digital research data, metadata, and code that's related to any publication. So an article or preprint that come from that funded research. So we don't have specific instructions yet on what that will look like or which funding opportunities, but that is going to start as well. So what are some ways we can practice good data management? So essentially what it boils down to is thinking about how you're organizing the information you're collecting. And in most of these cases, we're talking about either digital information, so like files that are created, or digitized information. So you might be collecting something that's on paper and pen, like you're taking notes in an interview, or you're having someone create like an artwork or something like that. But in order to analyze it or use it, you need to digitize it, like scan it and look at it into a computer or code it in a text coding software or something like that. So what we're talking about is more like that digitized content that is created. And typically we recommend that folks set up their folders by thinking about the project as the sort of high level unit of what they're working with. In some cases, you might have like a researcher, like a PI who has many students working on many different things, and they might want to organize their data by student. So each student might have their own folder rather than by project. So it's not like a set in stone kind of thing, but it's just something to remember that it will depend on what you're working on. And in most cases, it will make sense to organize it by project and then give access to different people working on the project to that same sort of like set of folders and subfolders. So then you'll see that there are some subfolders at a second level and a third level. And we normally recommend to not go beyond the fourth subfolder level. And this is partly because then it just becomes a bit like unwieldy, like you have so many folders that you're working in. If you're putting some of this data into a software that uses like scripting language like Python or R or something like that, or even like a Stata or something like that, it really matters where the folder is that you're pointing to in that software, and it can become a little bit like more difficult to keep track of it when you have a ton of folders within folders. That's the other main reason is that the name of each file contains the name of the folders it's in. So you might just see the name of the file like notes.doc, but actually it has all the names of the folders appended to that name first. So the more folders you have, the longer the name of that file, essentially. And when you try to pull a file with a super long name into some software, it can get cut off. So that can cause like some errors or some problems with the way that it's then saved after that. It can conflate, like files could have the same names if they keep getting cut off. So that can create a problem of like not being able to track back what was the original file, or having some like issues with syncing the information to the correct document, for example. So critically, we recommend that you have a folder where you put your data. So that's just called data. And within that, you would have a folder for the raw data. And so that's the data before you do anything to it. Like that's just what you actually collected. And then you would have a second folder where you work off a copy of that data, so that if anything happens to the data that you're analyzing, you can always go back to the original because it wasn't modified. And it's also important for like transparency and research for other researchers to be able to verify your findings and trust your findings. If you can't deliver the raw data and someone can't reverse engineer how you got from your findings back to the raw data, that really decreases the trust in what you're claiming out of that as evidence in the end. So it's really important to make sure to keep that separate and work off copies. And critically, you have like a folder at the end that has like the paper or the research output, like a poster or preprint or whatever it may be. But the idea is that if someone in 10 years was like, where is the data for this paper? Oh, it's exactly in that folder that says paper, because that was what the output was from the project. When you go into it, you find a PDF or of the article that was accepted, the manuscript that was accepted. You find any code that's needed to run on the data, and you find the data set that's related to that paper all together in that final folder. So you can think of it as like a linear progression. You work through your folders. At the end, you have this paper folder where you put not just the paper, but the data set that was used to generate the evidence in the paper. So that you don't have to worry about where it is. So you always know that the data set that was used for that paper is in that folder. So that's a way to sort of think about like long-term care for the data that you're collecting, but also transparency and reproducibility and things like that. I've linked in the slides, which I think will be made available. I'll send them along as well. To the tier protocol. So this was a project that brought together a bunch of researchers and faculty members at different universities for like a 2-day retreat over the course of like many years to talk about how to do reproducible digital research and to come up with a sort of boilerplate template for how you would set up your folders if you were working with data. And these, again, you don't need to have all the folders. Like if you're not working with scripting languages or coding, then you don't really need that folder. And this is not just for like quantitative data. This is totally fine for qualitative data as well. So as long as you're collecting something that's digital or digitized, it doesn't matter if you're doing qualitative or quantitative, you would want to set things up in a similar kind of way. But what I like about the tier protocol is you can actually click on the left-hand margin on any of those folders, and then it will open a sort of page that tells you what should be in those folders or what it means. So that can be a handy way to sort of remember how to set up a project or to get some ideas for how to set up your project and what are some of the sort of like consistent things that people are expecting when they open a folder that has the data related to a paper. They're going to expect to see a README file. They're going to expect to see metadata or code books or things like that. So there's some expectations around what makes research reproducible that are reflected in this scheme. So that's something that I think is really handy as well. Beyond just folders and working with folders and thinking about how to organize information in folders, there's also best practices for how to name files. So you set up your project folders in terms of project data, code. You might have a folder for like documents, things like your REB protocol, your funding application, your consent forms could all be in a different folder than the data itself. So you could keep all of that in one folder as well. But then there's also best practices for at the file level. So there's folder level and there's file level. And if you're doing both of these things in a consistent way, according to sort of like you're trying to standardize all of it, then you should be pretty organized. So it's just these two levels. So basically, when you're creating a file, one practice that's recommended is to use machine readable metadata or machine readable objects as much as possible, because that makes it easier for like software and programs and operating systems to like understand that information and be able to do operations on that information. So for example, if you're creating a file, you want to put the date that you created the file. In this format, ISO 8601. So that's the international standard for dates. So it's the standard that is machine readable, meaning that almost all computers, operating systems, software programs, if you put a date in this year, month, date format with digits, so not characters, but like numbers, it should be understood by machines to be a date. Like it doesn't, you don't need to do anything special. It will just read that as a date. And that's something that was agreed about, internationally in terms of like you could be working with a computer that's set to like whatever language, but it should still know that this is a date. If you open something in Excel and you have this in one of the cells as like you have the dates for some information you collected, even Excel will know that it's a date. So that's why it's important to be mindful of these kind of machine readable standards when they exist, because it can help you save time and not lose information. I also hear from folks like, okay, I don't need to put the date on my file because it's already in the metadata. If I take a photo with a camera, it's already, if you open the photo and go to properties, you'll see what date it was created. Like I don't need to add that to the file name. It's already embedded within the digital metadata of that file itself. In some cases, yes. And in some cases, some software will strip that metadata. So like if you want to make sure that you know exactly when that file was created, you should put the date in the name. For example, like if anyone uses like iCloud to store photos or to store information, like if you have an iPhone and you have the storage on iCloud, Apple has set their software so that when you try to export like a photo, it will strip that information, like the date it was created. So you would have to manually go back and add it to the file. So there's some software like that just does it inherently, and there's no way around it within the software itself. So just to be careful, I always recommend that. And then I recommend if you're working on many projects to think about putting an acronym for each project so that you can see right away if a file gets like lost from its folders, at least you know which project it was associated with. If you're working in a project where there's multiple people collecting information, so if you have a team where like a few people are doing interviews, you might want to have people put their initials in the file name so you know who did which interview without having to open that file. If you're collecting data on like a variety of topics, you might want to have a shorthand like topic or like some kind of notation about the topic so that you can quickly see like which file relates to what activity you've been doing in your research. And then critically, you want to version your files instead of changing the date. So like a lot of people, what they'll do is like if they change their file, like they open a transcript and they remove the like identifiers. So you have your name in the transcript or something, so they go in and they remove it. They'll change the date in the file name. But actually, the date should tell you when the file was originally created. And the way to show that you've updated the file is to use versioning. So to use like a version 002 or 003 or whatever, or 010 or something. And the reason why I'm showing it with leading zeros, so that means that there's like 2 zeros before the numbers in some cases, or 1 0, is because in the past we used to recommend that people put like a point or a period, like version 1.0 or 2.0 or 2.5. And we're no longer recommending that to use any punctuation in the file name because some software reads periods or points as a delimiter. And a delimiter is like a signal to a machine or a program or software to stop reading whatever it's reading or to stop its operation. So a slash or any kind of special character, if a computer is trying to run information, if it sees that, if it hits that point, it will just stop. So most programs and softwares, like the period is not a problem, but there are some like very popular ones in research that do read periods as delimiters. So just to get away from having to know that or not, we just recommend using leading zeros. And this is sort of like it has 2 leading zeros, the idea being that if you get to version 999, like if you're going to have more than 1,000 versions, maybe you want 4 leading zeros, but it's not very common. So usually 2 or 1 is fine. So anytime you make a change, you would save a new copy of that file as another version so that you'd have a record of all the changes you made across all these different versions of the file. And if you want to separate these elements like the date and the acronym and the topic, you can use a hyphen or an underscore because those are universally sort of read as not delimiters. But those are the only 2 that we recommend, and underscore is usually safer. And one thing to think about when you're naming files is that there is an implication for like how you can sort the information as a list in your system, like in your operating system or your file. If you have a file explorer in some whatever program or whatever operating system you're in, if you put the date first, it's very easy to order your files chronologically, right? But you could also think about scenarios where you'd want to group files together that belong to a certain category. So like if you wanted to order them by subject, you could have like the participant ID as the first element, and then you could order them first on that number, and then you would have all of participant 1's stuff together and all of participant 2's stuff together and stuff like that. You could also do it by type, like, okay, I want all my notes to be collected I want to see all the notes together. I want to see all the questionnaires together, or like whatever it is. You can also do forced ordering with numbering. So for example, in SharePoint, in like in Teams, like if you create a series of channels in Teams, or if you create folders in a document library in SharePoint, normally the intuitive thing that people think is like, when I create a folder, it will be ordered in the order that I created them, right? Like that it'll be chronological. Like if I create this folder, it'll be on top. And then if I create a new folder, then that one will be on top because it should be chronological with like when I created each folder. But actually in Microsoft products, it alphabetizes the folders. So no matter when you create something, it will rearrange them so that or maybe it's the other way around. Is it the other way around that they alphabetize them, or they create it in the order that you created it? I think they don't alphabetize it. They create it in the order you create it. One of those. Anyway, if you want to force it to be in the precise order that you want. Oh yes, it's alphabetized. So that's why it works with the forced numbering. You could put the numbering in advance, and that way it'll arrange it according to that numbering scheme chronologically. Yes, alphabetically. Thank you, person in the chat. Yes, that's why it makes sense that it's numbered. I got there by doing the circular talking. So yeah, if you want to sort of avoid them alphabetizing it, you'd rather it be in a specific order, you can use numbering. So that's a trick. I also recommend for projects in terms of documentation to create a README document. It won't sit in a folder, it will sit in that project folder. So you'll open the project folder and you'll see data folder, a scripts folder, or an output folder, but you'll also see one single file, and that'll be the README document. And that will have like important information about the project so that if like a new student starts on the project and they need to be caught up, then they can just go directly to this document. They can see how they should set up their folders, how they should name their files. If there's an abbreviations key, like, okay, we're using an acronym for the projects, you should have a list of the acronyms with what they actually mean. And then you don't have to like explain this every time to someone new on the project. So it can be updated or checked regularly. It's not like a set in stone thing. I mean, there should be some kind of process for updating it. Like it shouldn't be like everyone can update it all the time, but sort of like, okay, we've decided to do this major change with how we're organizing our information or who we're giving access to. So we're going to change some of this information. But otherwise it should be fairly stable. I'll show you some examples of how to keep track of like the file name and the standardization that you're going to use in your project. So whether you're alone or with a group, it can still be useful to have this because then you don't have to remember things in many years. Or if you want to publish your data, you have this nice package so other people can understand it. But I basically recommend to have a table where you just list every single type of file that you might collect in the research. So it could be like Word documents with interview transcripts. It could be in vivo files. It could be taget exports. So it could be Excel files. It could be images. It could be videos, whatever it is. So it's the type of the file, not really like what it is, but it can also depend on like if you're collecting something that is like super high resolution, it is going to be a very large image. You might have two like image categories. You might have like very large image and then normal image or something like that. So you have all the types, and then you would have a column where you would say, what's the schema of how we're going to name this file? So in this case, for this microscope image, we're naming it date underscore microscope underscore image number. Okay, that's fine, but what does it mean? Like, what does date mean? I might put the date as like, just the year or the year and the month. So, and what does microscope mean? So you critically also want to have a column where you have the key for your schema. So you have a schema of how you're naming the file name, and then you tell people what it means, like in what kind of way to actually implement that schema. So date means that it's in that ISO 8601 format, the year, month, date in digits. Microscope in this case, I guess they have names, so it's the name of the microscope. And the image number it's showing, it should be in sequential formatting, zeros with two leading zeros, 001, 002, etc. And really critically to have a column where you have examples. So show people how should that file name actually look in practice. And then just have a list of this for every single file that you might collect. And so when people roll on or roll off the project, more when they roll on, they can just refer to this and start naming their files. And they like normally you won't need people to have like a lot of training or explanation if it's written out in this kind of way and it's very clear. I also recommend to have a table with an abbreviations key. So you have a descriptor of the file name. So that could be things like location or interview participant or microscope. And then have a key. Well, maybe not participant because you don't want to put their names in a README document, but you might have like the location you did the interview or the equipment tool or whatever it is. Or you might have the initials of the interviewer, like the person who did the interview. And then you would want to say, what are those initials actually? Like what's that person's actual name if they're a member of the project team? That way you can have shorter file names with still that have a lot of information. And then you don't have to remember what shorthand you used for any of those kinds of descriptors in the file name. Okay, so I'm also going to talk, those were some of the best practices in terms of like doing research data management. So folders, file names, thinking about planning all of this in advance, the same way we might plan for like an ethics review. We would detail all the ways we're storing the data. So a lot of that information, if you're working with human participants, will also be sort of redundant to the REB application. Like you answer a lot of that information in that process. So you can sort of take some of that information as part of your data management planning. But if you're not working with humans, you would have to sort of think of that on your own. You don't have that other kind of process where you're having to detail those kinds of activities. Then we also, there's what you're doing during your project. So you're doing research data management during your project when you're actually working on the project. And then there's the project is finished. And now what do I do with my data? So the FAIR principles are something that apply to data, your project when it's finished, with the data set that relates to any publication. So any data sets that come out of your project that are used to inform the evidence of a article or a preprint or a book chapter or a book or whatever it may be, or poster, that's the data set that can be made fair. So it's not about, the FAIR principles don't really have anything to do with your project when you're actually working on it. You can set yourself up so that at the end of your project, you can easily make your data fair, but you can't make your data fair necessarily during the project unless you're willing to put it somewhere during your project before you're finished. So usually it's at the end. Some people are fine publishing their data before they even write their article or anything, but most people don't do that. So the FAIR principles it's an acronym, the framework. It stands for Findable, Accessible, Interoperable, and Reusable. It was a framework that came out of a community of practice that formed Force 11. So it's sort of like this NGO type organization that's made up of like publishers, librarians, and researchers who published a paper in Nature in 2016, I believe, about the FAIR principles, detailing what they were and that this should be seen as sort of like a gold standard aim of people finishing research. And there's like sort of a couple reasons why they came up with this, which I'll go into in a little bit as well. But they also have this asterisk, this caveat that it doesn't mean that data should be like open access, like completely open access, the way that we are promoting for publications. So there is a movement to make sure that there's an open access publication, a version of each publication that, researchers are producing. There is a big like mandate from funders to do that. But with data, it's more to make it as open as it possibly can be, but it can also be closed. It doesn't mean you have to make it open. If it's necessary to keep data under controlled access, that data can still be fair. So it's not like, it doesn't mean that you can't be fair with your data if you have data that's super sensitive, that can't be de-identified or something of that nature. So I will go into what each of these means precisely, and these are the items that come from Force 11's like definition of findable data, but I have a sort of TLDR, like too long didn't read, or like a sort of colloquial way of explaining what all of this means. How do you make your data findable? The data should be in a repository, a research data repository typically. And it must have some documentation about it, like it has to have some information explaining what it is. And it has to have a persistent identifier, a PID. So a persistent identifier for data is a sort of permanent link that points to your data. It's not a URL. And it makes the data findable because your data, it's like part of the way that your data is indexed in search engines. It pulls the DOI, and then that DOI points to a URL and allows like a search engine to sort of retrieve that data via the URL in that case. But if your data moves different URLs, you can change it in the backend infrastructure of, of the companies that hold the DOIs or the organizations that hold DOIs, which There's two major ones. There's Crossref and there's DataCite. DataCite is usually the ones that have the DOIs, that manage the DOIs for data sets. So the DOI will always be the same. It will persist. It's like a unique identifier for the data set, and they are machine readable. So machines can be automated to search the database of DOIs and find the URL related to your data or where the data is located, and then pull it into the result of a search engine. Like these processes can be automated because they're unique IDs for the data set. And then in terms of like putting your data in a repository, what does that mean? So we have some general versus domain versus institutional repositories. So there's different levels and types of repositories. If you're interested in looking for ones that are sort of like discipline specific, there's a website, Re3Data, that's like a database of data repositories. So it's a database of all the research data repositories that are available. We have an institutional repository, so that means one that's administered or managed by your institution. So we have a Dataverse instance, and that's part of a larger shared infrastructure service called Borealis that's in Canada. So most universities in Canada have this Dataverse instance that's centrally managed by Scholars Portal, which is an organization that's part of U of T. So U of T is sort of centrally managing all of the Dataverse instances. But I administer our local institutional Dataverse. So I'm the one who sets up the permissions and reviews data sets that goes into our Dataverse, for example. There's general ones like Zenodo, Dryad, Figshare, OSF, Furter that take any kind of data from anyone. There's domain specific that are more geared towards specific types of data, like ICPSR is a data repository that's based out of the University of Michigan, and it's focused on social science data. So almost their entire collection is social science related in some way. PhysioNet is a data repository that takes biosignal data, so that's like ECG, EKG, so things like where you're wearing a device and it's measuring some kind of signal. So things like that. So there might be one in your field that people use where they put all the same kind of data and it might be appropriate in that kind of case. But normally all of these data repositories are sort of built on the same principles. Like if you go to Google and search for a data set, whether it's an ICPSR or Figshare or the Dataverse, you should be able to find it no matter where it is. There's also the issue of depositing documentation. So we recommend that you don't think of a data set as just the files that have the data, but also that README file that might give people information about how to use the data set, a code or code book that you might need to use the data set, your data management plan. If you need to use a specific computing environment or specific software, then that should be noted with the data set as well. And I've talked about machine readable versus human readable metadata and just wanted to give a few more examples of what that means precisely because it matters more on the fair side as well to make a data fair. It has to have both human readable and machine readable. So human readable is like information so that a human can reuse that data set. So that's things like an abstract or a description of the data set or like notes. It could be in the format of like a Word document, which yes, a machine can read a Word document, but it's like harder for machines. But those are sort of built more for like people to be reading them. Machine readable metadata, so that's like data about the data, information about the data itself, are things like an ORCID ID. So that's a unique identifier for researchers. So if I put my ORCID ID on my data set that I publish, and I put my ORCID ID on the article that I publish, and I put my ORCID ID on other data sets, in my ORCID profile, you would see a list of all the things I've produced, right? Because they could be pulled by that machine, by like the background, like infrastructure. Like ORCID can talk to all of those different kinds of sites where you can embed your ORCID ID and it can pull that information and put it into your profile. It's not automated right now for everything, but like that's the dream is that, it would be fully automated and then you would have a place where you could point that would actually have all your stuff that you did in one place. It's sort of how Google Scholar works too. It's looking for things that you created and it's trying to create a profile of the outputs you have. And sometimes it's wrong because it's not using something that's uniquely identifying you. People have the same name and sometimes it gets mixed up on which person created which thing. So an ORCID ID would sort of solve that if everybody used them. Things like a CSV, a comma separated value file, or a tab delimited file are machine readable. Creative Commons licenses are machine readable. And then again, that ISO 8601 date format is machine readable. So accessible data, what does it mean? It doesn't mean it's open access. It just means that it has to be in a open or public repository. What that means is that you have to be able to find the page, a web page or somewhere where your data set is described, but it doesn't mean you have the ability to necessarily download the data from that page. It just means that you have to be able to see that there's a page that explains the data and allows somebody who has permission to download it, or it could be open access. You could just download it. But without having to log into the repository, without having to have an account on the repository, you're still able to see that the data set exists in the repository. You should also have metadata that are both human and machine readable. So a data set is not considered accessible if people can't understand what the data is or what it's about or how to use it. Then it's considered to be like, okay, it's like as if it doesn't exist. Because if you get to a page and there's no description and the files like have codes in them and you don't know what it is, then does it even matter that you can access it? Not really. Okay, what is interoperable data? This one is a little bit tricky, but basically the way that we describe it is the capacity to which the data can be merged with similar data. So it relies on standards, documentation, and metadata to tell people like if you can compare two data sets or variables. So I often use like geography as an example. So there's a lot of social science and and urban studies and other kinds of research that relies on getting data sets that have like information about geographic areas. So like what's the population in Montreal versus Ottawa, or what percent of people, what percent of people are under the age of 10 in Montreal versus Ottawa or whatever. But if you would have a data set that, if you want to look at the percent of children in many places and also some other kind of how many public libraries there are in these cities, but you have those libraries and children in two different data sets. Well, if they both have like places, like if one has Ottawa and the other has Ottawa, then you should be able to put those two together and say, okay, I have a data set here that says there's this many kids in Ottawa and a data set here that says there's this many public libraries in Ottawa. I should be able to put those things in the same data set. So that means it's interoperable, but you have to make sure that Ottawa is defined the same way in both of those data sets. Or Montreal, does it mean the greater Montreal area? Does it mean the city? How are they defining a city? How are they defining the area? In one case, it could be spelled Montreal, and in another case, it could be MTL. Are those the same things, right? So if you're not sure, it's not interoperable. But if you're sure you're comparing the same thing, the same level of region to the same level of region, the same city to the same city, then you can put those two things together and look at them together. That means they are interoperable. Another meaning of interoperable in this case of data is that you can take a data set and open it in different software. So if you have a Word document, for example, can you open it in Google Docs? Can you open it in a text editor? If you can, it's an interoperable format. Microsoft allows us to do that, but because it is a proprietary software, they could at some point just say like, we don't care anymore. Like no more opening Word in Google, no more opening Word in text. Like we're gonna, make it so that you're blocked from doing that. Then it would not be interoperable. So we say to avoid that problem or potential problem, it's best to use open file formats that are not owned by a company and that can be opened in any software, whether it's proprietary or open source. So things like a CSV file instead of an Excel file. So a CSV can be opened in Excel, it can be opened in Google Sheets, it can be opened in GIS software, it can be opened in tons of different kinds of software. Nobody owns the CSV file format. Same with like a .text file format or things like that. So I have a list here of some common ones that we also call preservation file formats. So it's not just that the issue of like a proprietary software, like a company deciding like, oh, we're going to block you from opening our types of files in other kinds of programs, sort of like Adobe Acrobat, like Adobe blocks the PDFs generated in Adobe Acrobat from being opened in other kinds. There's ways to circumvent it, but they make it very, very difficult to use their PDF format in other programs. There is an open PDF format that you can also open in Acrobat, but most of the ones we're creating in Acrobat are then not going to be open because they block that feature. So the other issue is like there's not just the issue of the proprietary software, but there's also the issue of over time, a company just might not make that software anymore. They might deaccession the software, meaning that you won't have any way to open that file, even if they would let you, they're just not making the software anymore. They're not updating it, so it becomes obsolete, that file format, and then you can no longer even access the information in it unless you have an old computer spinning up old software that someone in a library has decided to like maintain for that specific reason of being able to open that one type of file. So to get around that, to like mitigate that risk of obsolescence of like your file becoming obsolete over time, and not being usable at all, is to save them in these sort of open file formats, or what we call also preservation file formats. They're more likely to maintain and be preserved over time because they're not dependent on a company making the software to open them. So things like RTF or text for Word, things like CSV or tab for spreadsheets, MP3 for audio, TIFF or JPEG for images, things like that. So what is reusable data? So that's the last part of the FAIR acronym, the R. It doesn't mean that you have to let people reuse your data. It just means there should be a clear terms of use. So people should be able to know what they can or cannot do with your data. So reusable just means that without a license, you can't reuse it at all because the owner retains the copyright on it. But with a license, you may be able to reuse it depending on what the license says. And that data should have information about its origin and its version history. If you don't know if you're working with the authoritative version of a data set, then it makes it harder to reuse it. So if you have the data set published in 5 different places, and people don't know which one is the one that's related to the paper or which one is the one that came first, it can be very hard to figure out like which one to choose or how to even deal with that. And they start to sort of lose their value or their like reusability factor because you can't trace it back to a source of origin. So that's really important as well in terms of like thinking of how to make the data reusable. And just in terms of like, what does it mean by licenses and Creative Commons and all those kinds of things? So there's a set of licenses that are issued by this organization called Creative Commons. It's a nonprofit. And these are machine readable. They can be assigned in the metadata to a data set. And then like, for example, if you search in Google, there is a filter in search engines that allows you to search for open access or like an openly licensed material, and then it will not put in the search results anything that's under copyright. And it can do that because of these licenses that are assigned to the data sets or to the information. And it can do that because it's machine readable. It can be automated to figure out a CC0 license means there's no copyright. Like it doesn't need to read through terms of use or anything like that. So the open licenses include 2. There's CC0, that's no copyright, dedicated to the public domain. Anyone can take it and do whatever they want with it. And there's also CC BY, which is considered an open license as well. It just requires that if you reuse the data set, you have to give an attribution to the creator. So in most cases for research data, that means you have to cite the original producer of the data set in your references. So you would get a citation for that data set. There's also non-open licenses, things like non-commercial, which is considered not open because it restricts the use of the data to like research and education, not for profit reasons. And then no derivatives, the ND license is considered the most restrictive because it you can't change anything in the data set. You can't add a new variable. You can't like copy and paste anything and take anything out of context of what it was originally. So it has very limited reuse because usually when you publish a data set, you've used all of it that you can use for your own publications. And the way that people would reuse it normally is to change it or merge it with another data set or adapt it. And if they can't, it makes it very hard to do anything with it beyond the original study. I've also included in the slides a fair data checklist. So, if you want to go through these items, then that can help you realize if you're publishing your data, if it's fair. So things like, is it in an open repository? Does it have a registered DOI? Is it in an open format? Is it discoverable through a search engine? And the way you know that is if you have to look in the data repository information to see if that repository is indexed in search engines. Most major ones are, like the Dataverse is indexed in search engines, Zenodo, Dryad, Figshare, OSF. They're all indexed in search engines. Otherwise, they're not very useful, so most of them will be, but it's something worth checking to be sure. Also, do you have like documentation or metadata? Are the files unambiguously named in the metadata? Are they described? Did you include information about software requirements or if information has to be converted into a different format? Does it include like terminology or jargon? Like, are you going to define things for the people using it? Are there acronyms that need to be explained? Does it include machine readable standards where available, like ORCIDs or the 8601 data standard? Have you linked the related publications in the metadata of the data set so that people can see where it was used and what it's related to? And then things like, is there a license and stuff like that? So everything that I discussed already. And I'm going to end a few minutes early and stop the recording in case that there's any questions. Just give me a second to stop the recording.